John said something really outrageous and we stand up and march out together.
Didn't like that, John.
Shall we get this party started, everybody? We are so privileged to have John Harmon here yet again. How many times have you taught for us now, John?
I think this will be the 5th.
No, but in the spring, last spring.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, I think it's like the 10th or something like
They
that.
keep coming back. It's amazing.
I know. We're so honored to have John, who has his PhD in church history with
Tudor, Stuart, England.
Tudor, Stuart, England.
That's Henry VIII, etc. Yeah.
It's like Billy Joel at the Garden, you know, you just keep doing shows.
I don't get paid $1 million a show.
Yeah.
I'm waiting.
You mean the checks haven't been coming?
No.
So we have the privilege of having John here yet again to talk on the topic of Mardi Gras, which I have to be honest, I've never heard a presentation on, so I'm really excited to hear your take on it. So
Well,
we're going to go ahead and get started.
Thank you.
So thank you
When
for
Rich
being
asked me to do a bit on Mardi Gras, I thought, well, what is that and what should I do? So, Rich, sometimes what you get, what you wish for, you actually get in a different way. So maybe this is not exactly what you expected, but we'll do our best.
Are you gonna throw beads at us?
So I guess the question I'll start with is,
that when it does. You didn't ask if he
what do we think Mardi Gras is? What is your idea of Mardi Gras?
Well, John, I was telling you that as I walked over up South Street today, apartment car over my parish house, I walked by Revolution, which is one of the bars on South Street, and they had an enormous purple, green, and gold display out that was billing last night's big Mardi Gras crawl, which hit like 6 different bars in Morristown. And I was saying to you earlier, I sure would not have been wanting to work at the last of those 6.
Okay, well that's one view of Mardi Gras.
Yeah.
Any other ideas? What do you think of when you think of Mardi Gras?
Lent.
What? Lent. Okay, I think you're probably one of the few, but
I was gonna say
maybe
that.
not.
pancakes.
Pancakes, okay. Anybody?
Alcohol.
Alcohol. Right. Any location you think of in Mardi Gras?
New Orleans.
And I've got to tell you, if you were to ask 1,000 people on the street what they thought of Mardi Gras, they would say, "Oh, it's a party in New Orleans." So, given that, let me give you this is, by the way, from the, there is a Mardi Gras website. And this is the New Orleans Mardi Gras website image. Why is this? It was working before, Audrey.
Maybe go back a slide and then forward a slide.
Let's try this again.
Spring breaks don't happen anymore at 65, but it's close. It's been awesome. Last night, little long days, but we suck it up and move on. It was great.
I would say if you want to get a different experience than just get outside of your city, have some good fun, come to Mardi Gras.
And you don't meet no strangers now. Hey, everybody's very friendly and approachable. I love that.
We do what we do because there's nothing like it in the world. There's nothing like Mardi Gras in the United States.
Mm-hmm. let's get a little bit of history here on Mardi Gras in New Orleans. It's actually French for Fat Tuesday, and the reason for the name Fat Tuesday is?
Get rid of the fats before Lent.
Right, that's right. Get rid of all these temptations and get ready for Lent. This is held in New Orleans. This is the site where most people think of Mardi Gras. Turns out that Mardi Gras
party in Rio.
Pardon?
Isn't it a bigger party in Rio?
Well, actually, I have a video on that. Thank you, John. Getting ahead of me, but yeah, it's actually a worldwide event. But we'll talk more about it in a minute or two. It was brought to the U.S. by a French explorer in the early 18th century. This is well before the Revolution, and in doing so, they were able to populate these parties throughout the Gulf of Mexico and up the Mississippi. So you'll see Mobile, Alabama as one of them, and St. Louis is another. So this influence has spread beyond New Orleans, involves singing and dancing. It turns out that Mardi Gras in New Orleans is not just that Fat Tuesday, or not just that few days before Lent. It starts just after Epiphany, if you can believe that. So there are weekend celebrations after Epiphany up until the week before Lent, Mardi Gras, in which case it's a daily affair, and people come from all over, I guess, the world to celebrate, if that's the right word, the Mardi Gras. So that's most people's view of what Mardi Gras is about. So in New Orleans, it's a big drunken party. Excuse me. Let's see here. Now I'm gonna try this again, see if animations will work this time. No, slideshow. All right. Let's see if this works.
Oh, there you go, John.
John, I never had understood until you showed both these videos how Presbyterian.
It's everywhere, isn't it? And so there's a theme here. It's painted faces, it's funny hats, it's a parade, it's a lot of singing. But for the Portuguese, this could very well appear in New Orleans. But it doesn't stop there. So in France,
Mardi Gras is celebrated in several different ways. One popular tradition is the use of masks and costumes. Many participants in the parades wear masks and costumes, ranging from simple masks to elaborate, full-body costumes. The use of masks and costumes is said to have originated in medieval times, when people would wear them to conceal their identities and participate in celebrations without fear of repercussions. However, the parade is the most popular tradition of Mardi Gras. The parades feature colorful floats decorated with flowers and lights that are driven through the streets of cities and towns across the country. The floats are often accompanied by dancers and musicians dressed in elaborate costumes, adding to the event's festive atmosphere. Here are the top 5 carnivals in France that you should not miss. The Nice Carnival is France's largest and most famous Mardi Gras celebration. It has been held annually since 1873 and features a parade of floats, each more spectacular than the last, with historical and political themes. The Malus Carnival is known for its giant puppets and figures carried through the streets. This carnival is one of the oldest in France and is celebrated with great enthusiasm.
It turns out that almost every major European city has a Mardi Gras. Moscow has a Mardi Gras. Yeah. So the question you're probably asking yourself, at least this is a question I ask myself, is what does this have to do with Lent? We'll get into that first, but just to let you know, there is a celebration that's a little bit more Lent-like and a little less Mardi Gras-like, and that has to do with Shrove Tuesday.
Our eve of a wonderful season of grace, what we call season of Lent. Today is known as Shrove Tuesday, also known as Pancake Tuesday. Let me take you through a little background as to why it's known as Shrove Tuesday. Shrove means to take away the flesh, to cast off the things of the flesh and to prepare spiritually for Lent. And that's how you get the word carnival, which comes from the Latin word carnem levare, which means to take away the flesh. Unfortunately, somewhere down the line in the tradition of the church, carnival has got a negative meaning. It went on to become a time of merriment and indulging in the pleasures of the flesh. Well, that's not what it means. It's a time to take away the flesh.
The flesh. I love that. I love that. So that's closer to the theory of why there ought to be some pre-Lenten activities. But this is the theory, and this is the practice.
If you got a whiff of maple syrup or lemon and sugar wafting through the air today, it's probably because millions of people around the world were tucking into a tasty stack of pancakes. But it's not just because they were hungry. There's actually a lot more to it, and it's all to do with Easter. So guys, what's with the pancakes?
Well, it's Shrove Tuesday where we have a Christian tradition to eat pancakes.
They look pretty yummy, don't they? So why do we eat pancakes on Shrove Tuesday?
Well, it's the beginning of Lent, so we take all the rich foods in our house, such as eggs, butter, milk, and all sorts of foods like that, and we make pancakes.
So, and by the way, this church has a Pancake Tuesday, yes?
We're doing it on Ash Wednesday, though. But you get your pancakes and then you go right into Ash Wednesday,
all right.
so they're separate.
All right. Hold your nose, eat your pancakes. All right, so that's sort of the background of Mardi Gras on Shrove Tuesday. But when you think about it, this is really all about Easter and all about Lent. And I thought, let's review what we know of the history of Easter celebrations and Lent, and to see how we got from there to here. And so, let's talk more about this. The first century. This is the century where Christ was crucified and resurrected. There were from the Gospels and from Paul's letters, nobody was an eyewitness to the crucifixion. Mark does have some reference to Mary and Mary Magdalene being present. Also pointed out that the disciples had fled. So there really wasn't any eyewitnesses, which were the basis of the written account of the resurrection and the crucifixion. So, well, how do you go about celebrating Easter during this very early formative time? What did they do? Well, these were small little communities. There hadn't yet been an idea of formalizing the recognition of the resurrection and the crucifixion, but there was gatherings, usually every week, and over time there came to be, since a lot of this was word of mouth, nobody saw it, word of mouth, over time there came to be some recognition that yes, this is an important event to remember. And what they tended to do was to have these recognition events during their worship service every Sunday. And the worship service included some period of fasting before the service began, and it also included baptism of new members. And of course you had to be penitent in order to be qualified for that status. So it was a very somber, serious event done every week. Now, over time, this became much more formalized. So, formalized fasting and baptism for new members. It became a part of an Easter celebration. I don't know that anybody said consciously that this is Easter, this is what we're doing, but over time it became much more formalized. So by the time the second, third centuries arrived, there became a call to say, look, we need some uniformity here. And by the way, that was a request, demand really, that the church had made it of itself in all sorts of ways. Doctrine, rituals, belief systems. A lot of this came from the Gospels themselves and from Paul's letters, but it was a slow process. And there really wasn't anything like what we think of Easter then, even during the second century. It was slowly to develop. It was also a question of, well, if we have such a thing as Easter, when do we have it? Do we have it every Sunday? Do we have it around Passover, which is, of course, according to the Gospels, when the crucifixion occurred? If so, do we follow the Jewish calendar, or do we follow some other timing device? And after some discussion, over time, they decided that it wouldn't follow Passover, but it would be on a Sunday. And there would be a recognition of the crucifixion on a Friday. So a lot of the hardware, if you will, of our Easter celebration began to form about this time. And by the way, the name Easter was based on the Latin term alpes, which is English for the dawn. Now I can't tell you why they used a German word to replace the Latin word, but the German word was Eastarum, hence Easter. And so choosing when to celebrate gradually came into understanding. Use of the word gradually came in the understanding. And finally this question was settled at the Council of Nicaea. Now you may remember from my spring material, the Council of Nicaea was called by Constantine because he recognized that Christianity was going to be the religion of the empire, and he demanded a little bit more uniformity here. So he called together the bishops to say, okay, well, what do we believe? Out of this came the Holy Trinity, the idea of 3 in 1. Out of this came the idea of the rituals associated with the church. And out of this idea came some expression of what Easter was all about. When to do it, how to do it. This was all settled in 325. Now, I should tell you that this didn't happen all at once, all over the empire. It was spotty. It was here and there and everywhere. But the bishops who were called together in Istanbul to perform the Council of Nicaea tasks, they demanded uniformity. As they spread throughout the empire, this became much more consistent from location to location. It took a long time. Now, so the question is, now we have Easter. Well, how do we prepare for Easter? What do we do in order to prepare for this very holy, very important event in the Christian calendar? Well, there was a tradition coming from Judaism for fasting. And many Christians had fasted as a part of their worship service, both in the service itself and at other times of the year. So fasting was an important activity that needed to occur. So it became an important part of the Easter preparation. Why? Well, because Jesus fasted in the wilderness for 40 days. So we're celebrating Easter. We're celebrating Christ's resurrection. The least we can do is to follow his guidance to say, okay, 40 days of fasting. Now the question is, well, what does fasting look like? Is it privation from food and water for 40 days? Not a lot of Christians after that. So the question is, what do we do? So the Council of Nicaea, again, formalized that there is this period called Lent. And it will be featuring fasting and prayer during the 40 days preceding Easter. Oh, by the way, I probably should have told you, they determine how the date of Easter, there was a slide on that. Let me go back, I'm sorry. Let's see here. Yeah, here we go. Did y'all see that? Let me get this slideshow. Yeah. They didn't want to follow the Jewish calendar, which is by the 14th day of Nisan, which is roughly the month of March. The Jewish calendar follows the lunar schedule, so every 30 days, not the 28, not the 31, but every 30 days. And so there's a disjuncture between our calendar and the Jewish calendar. The same thing here. They didn't want to follow the Jewish calendar. So they said, well, how do we determine this? And they said, okay, even more complicated, the 14th day, after the first full moon, following the spring equinox, which is why we have Easter in late March, in late April, and your guess when this year's Easter appears. So thank you, Council of Nicaea, for determining this, but that's what we got, and we have honored that since then. Okay? Let's see. Yeah, okay, so they also define, okay, what's fasting? What do we mean by a fast? Well, they're going to say, look, fasting, 1 meal a day. No meat, no fish, no eggs, no dairy products. All those are rich foods meant for the wealthy and the privileged. We are going to follow the guidance, the example of Jesus, and limit ourselves only to those foods that sustain us. That's it. Nothing more than that. So, and that's, by the way, what many Christians will do today, is to follow that kind of rigor. Not the Presbyterian Church, but that's another matter. We'll get into that. They also used this Lent, this is the Council of Nicaea now, as an opportunity to initiate those who wish to join the church, following the idea coming out of the first century, where every Sunday there would be an initiation of new members. Well, you had to be penitent. You had to show your belief and your commitment to a Christian. So how do you do that? Well, Council of Nicaea said, you're dressed in sackcloth and you cover yourself in ashes, and that's the way you show your penitence to the rest of the world. Hence, Ash Wednesday, which is why we still recognize some of the ideas coming out of the Council of Nicaea in 325, to give you an idea of just how enduring some of these traditions are.
John?
Yes.
Sackcloth and ashes was used for mourning?
Well, it has been, but in this case, it was done to show your commitment to joining the church.
So this is like the least you can wear, and oh, by the way, I'm going to cover myself in ashes.
Yeah, well, covering yourself is probably a little too, but yeah, ashes were a part of it. Cover your clothing, maybe smear some ashes on your face, just to show that I am a committed Christian and I'm going to dress this way to show that. And yeah, sackcloth and ashes are a form of a burial ritual. I understand that. But that's not what the original purpose of doing that was, coming out of the Council of Nicaea in 325. Okay? By the way, we all familiar with the Nicene Creed? Council of Nicaea. We've modified it a little bit, but for the most part, the creed comes out of that time. Again, given the power of tradition in the Christian church and how many things occurred way back then that we still recognize today. Mardi Gras was not one of them, but I'm going to get there in a minute or two. Okay, so
you just, your final bullet point had to do with Protestant reformers rejecting.
Oh, yes, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Thank you. So, so this question of what we do during Lent was questioned by the Reformation. John Calvin, you know John Calvin? John Calvin was the inspiration behind the Presbyterian Church. I just have you know, his idea of the elect was one of the principal doctrinal ideas of the Presbyterian Church. There are losers and there are winners, and just hope you're a winner, but you don't know. Well, this was one of them. The Reformation looked at this and said, this is not scriptural. We have to be scriptural. And there's nothing in the scriptures, nothing in the Gospels about having some kind of a Lenten experience. As a matter of fact, John Calvin thought it was vanity. It was something you just did to show that you are a believing Christian and you want the world to know. No, it's faith. It's not what you do. It's not how you puff up your chest and say, I'm a Christian. You need to be devout in your heart. And so any display of any holiness out of scene. So a lot of this came through the Reformation. Some churches, Reformation churches, adopted it, like the Presbyterian Church. Some didn't. The Lutheran Church continued, of course, to observe all of the practices in Lent that the Council of Nicaea established. Thank you for...
And I would imagine today, in certain parts of our country where an evangelical or fundamentalist, religiosity still is pretty powerful, I imagine there might not be a lot going on Ash Wednesday in many of those churches, right?
Nothing.
Yeah.
That's right. So, okay, and that gets into the whole idea of Christianity in America,
right,
and how the evangelical movement in the First and the Second Great Awakening changed what people believed and how they expressed their Christianity.
Which is another talk.
That's
right?
That's another talk. I won't bore you with that, but it does give you an idea that while we do rely on a lot of the traditions coming out of many thousands of years ago, it's changed, and we've changed. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying one of the things I find so interesting about church history is, well, that was then, and this is now, and why is that? And what does this say about what we believe? I'm not here to point my fingers at anybody. I'm just saying it's important, at least for me, to understand a little bit about the history, to understand the richness of our tradition, and why we think and do what we do. Okay? Keep coming with the questions, because obviously I'm ignoring material that's on the slides, so forgive me. Okay, so you have this Lent. Well, that's a bit of a jump in a cold pool, which is to say, suddenly you're walking around and then you're dressed in sackcloth and ashes and you're you're fasting and you're praying, and there's got to be a better way to do this. So the church believed that in order to properly help people begin the Lenten experience, they needed a little, encouragement. So there were times when the church would say, look, Lent's coming up, I want us to think more prayerfully about who we are and what we do. You all familiar with Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur?
Yeah.
It's similar, roughly similar in an idea. In order to prepare for your atonement, you have to think about your sins. You have to think about the past year, some good, some bad, and it was that idea, that tradition, that moved the church toward having some opportunity to let people think more about what they intend to do during the Lenten experience. So there was these pre-Lenten thought experiments, if you will, that the church helped organize and to help support. However, it began to change. Shrove Tuesday was meant to enlighten the preparations by encouraging the consumption of foods that you denied yourself during Lent. So typically it was meats, eggs, dairy. All those were meant to be consumed so you didn't have the temptations up in your cupboard, right? Oh, there's that. No, don't do that. Consume it now, and that way you'll be able to have a full heart in moving through the 40 days of Lent. Hence the pancake breakfast. Also, you have to understand that Christianity was being nurtured and developed and grew alongside the Roman Empire. And there were a number of festivals in the Roman Empire which gradually Christianity began to absorb in one way or another. For instance, the veneration of Mary as a saint came from the Roman focus on Isis, who was a goddess of forgiveness and understanding. So there was nothing in the scripture about Mary being a saint, mother of Jesus, of course, but nothing holy about Mary. But this influence began to affect Mary's position in the church. Same thing here. There were a lot of pagan festivals that Christians began to use as a way to prepare for Lent. Maybe done innocently enough, I don't know. Certainly you can't imagine in, say, 400, that people were beginning to paint their faces and put on silly hats and march through the streets of a particular city. But over time, these influences began to affect the pre-Lenten activities. Hence, Mardi Gras. Now, I'm not here to tell you that I think Mardi Gras is a great thing. I think it's vulgar. I really don't like to see people drink themselves silly and wear paint on their faces and put silly hats on and parade around the streets of a particular American city. It's shameful, in my view. But there's just me.
There's you and John Calvin.
Yeah, that's right. Bring back John Calvin. Where is he?
You don't like parades?
So, but on the other hand, that's just me, and I don't want to influence your thinking about what you think of any. Yes?
Well, this sounds a lot like medieval misrule. Days of misrule, where they flopped the authorities. So the king becomes the servant becomes the king, and there's all kinds of mischief about them.
Exactly. All of which derives in some manner or form from a lot of the pagan festivals that occurred in the Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
Let's face it, the Middle Ages didn't simply lose their association with the Roman past. It continued in one way or another over time, and in some ways we see today. No question about it. So the question becomes, what about us? What do we think? And I gave Audrey a little warning on this. I said, well, what does the Presbyterian USA Church say about Lent and about preparing for Lent?
I got a warning 30 seconds before the presentation, so that was as much warning as I got. But I will say, I mean, Lent is my favorite season of the church year because it's a reminder of what are we really doing as a church community? What does our faith tell us and inform us about getting back to the basics, whatever that looks like for us? So, you know, while, sure, we can give up sugar. I've done that many years, and I don't know if it brings you any closer to God, right? You know, to not have your dark chocolate. You know, to me, I feel closer to God when I have dark chocolate. So, but to have that reminder of what is our faith, where is God in our lives, and so I see Lent as being a reminder of coming back to our community, coming back to our faith as individuals. And I think the Presbyterian Church sees it that way too. Although, you know, we have some Presbyterians who fast, we have some Presbyterians who do prayer, who do Lent devotional. You know, there's a spectrum of different things, obviously, that we can be doing. But maybe not to the extreme, not the extreme, but the, you know, as much as what the original, you know, the Catholic Church certainly did.
So what you're saying is that in spirit, we observe Lent in some ways like traditionally Lent has been observed.
Right.
Each of us, we deny something in our lives. We follow a certain pattern of how we behave during this very important Christian period known as Lent.
Or do something, right? Like, you don't have to give
Yes.
up something, but you could also, you know, pick up a new prayer practice or read your Bible every day. You know, there are things that you can do, which to me I think are often more meaningful than giving something up. But some sort of reminder of, you know, what is this season all about?
So I guess, thank you, Audrey, for that surprise question. But I guess a question I would ask us all is, well, what do we do? And there's no right answer. This is not a test. But how do we observe Lent? Anything at all? Do we ignore it, or do we do something? Do we have some thoughts during these 40 days prior to Easter? Let me know. Yes.
Often there's a devotion book that's written by members of the church to use during Lent.
Ah, I see. Okay. Yeah, very personal. And let's face it, this is a very personal experience. So there's no one way to observe Lent, as long as you find something to do or something to avoid that is meaningful for you in preparing for this very important Christian holy day known as Easter. Anybody? Yes?
I think by taking advantage of programs and things that are held during the season of Lent or Holy Week, I think it makes it more meaningful when you think that you're working up to eventually the crucifixion of Jesus. So I think by taking advantage of things like this is important.
I've been a Presbyterian almost all of my life, except for about 10 years on a little break, and I was Episcopalian. But I really don't remember anything happening in Lent when I was maybe 12 through my teenage years. And the idea of putting ashes on your forehead was like, ooh, that's a little Catholic, isn't it? And I really don't have a recollection of a Lenten practice until I was maybe in my late 20s or my early 30s. And then I remember ashes coming in and being observant of Shrove Tuesday. That was all new to me. I don't remember that ever being a practice.
You know, like Nancy, did you grow up in New Jersey?
I did.
Yeah, so did I. Grew up in fairly heavily Catholic North Jersey. To me, Lent was something that my Catholic friends
Yes.
did, cared about, committed to. When I started going back to church in my middle 20s, it was at a Presbyterian church, not too far from here. I remember nothing about any kind of Lenten observances. Maybe they were there, but I can't remember them. I became a Lutheran in my early 30s and was there until my 50s, and their Lent caught for me, and it became, like with you, one of my favorite seasons of the church year. And one of the things that I began to experiment with was fasting. I started out by missing one meal every Wednesday. And somebody, when I explained that to them, they thought, wow, that's not much. So, I don't know. I thought, well, maybe it isn't much, so maybe I'll try to fast for all of Wednesday, every Wednesday during Lent. And that was a pretty good challenge. And among other things, the merit of it was, it made me think about people that have to miss a day of eating because of circumstance. In that respect, it was a very powerful spiritual discipline.
That's really interesting. It also brings to mind, if I can, during the first and second Great Awakening, they were spiritual experiences that were meant to shine a light on some of the emptiness of Christian Presbyterian practices during the 18th and 19th century. There needed to be much more emotion. There needed to be much more commitment. And I noticed in a paper the other day that the Pew Research Institute, which does surveys on the church and Christian beliefs, noticed that there has been a stop in young people walking away from the church. Now there are more people recognizing that, yes, maybe the church is important. What's my point here? My point is that to some extent, there's something missing in our lives, and we reach out and try to find that thing, whatever it is, that brings meaning and spiritual experience to our lives. And your experience, Rich?
That fasting experience taught me that I had maybe a little bit more self-discipline than I thought. I will also tell you that the Thursday morning bowl, Quaker, brown sugar maple, boy, did it taste good.
Well, but that brings up, if I can just change the subject violently.
Yeah.
So what do we think of what Pancake Day did at church? What did we think of Shrove Tuesday before this very knowledgeable Catholic priest talked about the flesh? Any idea?
I don't remember doing pancakes. I grew up very Catholic, and I went to Catholic school. Lent is one of my favorites also. It's kind of a reboot time. It gives you an opportunity
that's a good
to just jump in and reboot yourself because you plug into all the things. I mean, we had to go to Stations of the Cross every Friday. We went to Mass. We had to go to Mass. I went to church more often just because it was a private thing. I like to go to daily Mass, and it was more of a reflection. I always had trouble with the fasting thing because as a kid you had to fast before Mass. I always have a tendency to run low blood sugar. I can't tell you how many times I passed out in church because the incense would make me sick, and I was really starving, and we'd go to late Mass, so it was always problematic. So I never saw the value in fasting because me personally, physically, it was never a good combination. I always thought it was better, like you said, instead of trying to give up something which made you set you up for failure, try to do something good, and then you did good, even if you didn't do it every day. I don't remember eating pancakes. We probably ate pancakes on Fridays because we weren't eating meat, but it wasn't. I never remember having pancakes.
You know, you bring up a really good point. I don't know where I heard this, but the idea of sacrifice is a Catholic formative belief. And I don't actually remember learning anything about that as a Presbyterian. it was all about doing more and being more instead of, as it was interpreted to me, being less. So I wondered about that.
There were just parameters that you sort of fit into.
Well, one of the reasons why I wanted to pose these questions is to have each of us think about what is the meaning of Lent for us, and how do we recognize that? And there's no wrong answer. It's a very personal thing. And maybe Nancy's experience about Lent informs us about what we might want to do or not. But I thought important, as long as we're going to talk about Mardi Gras, as we're going to talk about that, let's talk about something that's meaningful, spiritually meaningful for us. And that's why I asked these questions. And so I hope that this has been an interesting thought experiment for you all. And unless we have anything...
I have another thought.
Yes.
Because I had no idea really anything behind Mardi Gras, except I sort of thought, well, maybe it's a giant, excessive celebration of funness, because it's pretty solemn as you're coming in to it. Because then you've got the resurrection that we're shooting for, and that is like spring. It's everything is new again. But it's, so you have to celebrate, and then you have to hunker in and be really mindful of what's going to happen. I thought that was a celebration, because then we're used to not eating so much and not having candy.
It's also interesting that Mardi Gras is also timed with the traditional greetings of spring. It's a celebration of spring that people have applied to Mardi Gras and to the church. So again, this comes out of a tradition that's thousands of years old. There usually would be a festival in the fall to celebrate the harvest. There'd be a festival in the wintertime to celebrate the end of the year. There'd be a festival in the spring, all of which was timed around the agrarian schedule. Nobody wanted anything to do with an event that took you out of the field. So a lot of this, what we see, is built into traditions that we have seen for thousands of years.
I can't remember seeing anybody with a smudge of ashes on their head until I was a school teacher, and my dear friend Tom O'Brien, who was very devout, must have gone to mass that morning and he'd come into school with this thing on his forehead, and it was kind of gross, you know? What do you, Tom, what is
Wash
this?
your face.
And I never at that point thought I would ever do that. And now I go to Ash Wednesday service every year. I get that cross on my forehead, and I look around and I see some of you in this room perhaps who have been Presbyterians nonstop for a longer time than I would imagine. And my question is, to some degree, for those of you that, I mean, Nancy just talked about this, but there may be other people in the room. Has Lent changed for those of you that have been long-time Presbyterians? Are you approaching it? Are you finding yourself in rituals that are different from, and maybe they were non-existent in the past? Can anybody speak to that?
My small group, and I probably the others in the church too, we always do a Lent study, and it's always just it's a whole different mood than our regular Friday mornings. And I think one of the studies that I enjoyed the most, and it's been a few years ago, was the wilderness. And it kind of began with Jesus in the wilderness, and it's looking at wilderness experiences in our lives, and it was a tremendously moving book. I like that one very much. I still have it, still look at it. But I'm also thinking that John Calvin idea of, not just showing up in sackcloth and ashes, but not showing off in any way is part of it. And that still lingered, because I don't remember, we never celebrated Lent until, I think the church I grew up in, they do now, but never. And some years ago, I went to a Ash Wednesday service with my mother when I was visiting, and there were ashes. And I just didn't think about it. And we got outside and my mother said, rub those ashes off. Somebody might see.
Yeah. You know, what I'm hearing is that maybe in response to a material world that is becoming so oppressive for some of us, that observing Lent is a way to escape from that.
Yeah.
A meaningful spiritual experience that allows us to remove ourselves from this very material world we find ourselves in. I wonder about that. But I'm hearing from you that Lent may have a greater meaning for you now as opposed to then. Yes,
Go
Phil.
ahead. I was just thinking, what always stuck with me about Lent, and I think it's because it goes all the way back to my earlier Catholic roots as a kid, is that phrase the priest would use when they would put the ashes on, from dust you were created, and from dust into dust you will return. And it always left a very deep impression on me because I felt it was the lowest common denominator of existence. And we have a certain amount of time. But dust we were and dust we will ultimately be again. What are you going to do with that time in between? So that always stuck with me. That's the memory of Lent that sticks with me. And
that's interesting. Whenever I have these sessions, the number of Catholics that appear are significant.
Oh, we're like ants. We're just
and I'm not trying to accuse anybody of anything. It's just that for some reason, and my wife is an example of this. She found the Catholic Church to be containing, to be so rigid and so impersonal that she was fighting to find another religion that was. Now, I'm not saying Catholics are bad. In many ways, the ritual and the awe and the splendor of the Catholic ceremony gives people spiritual fulfillment, and that's great. But I think, to your point, Phil, there's some things about your religious past which you're trying to address in some ways, and perhaps our approach to Lent is one of those ways in which we're trying to do that.
I also think things like Catholic Charities and Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement. There's some really important stuff the Catholic Church does in terms of social justice. Lent, I think, if you can approach it this way, it can be a season of relative quietude and reflection, sandwiched between big old Christmas and sometimes kind of gaudy Easter, and its austerity and its quietude is actually maybe good for you physically, emotionally, and a lot of other spiritual.
Right. There's
no presents, no big dinners.
There's no Lenten eggs, no Lenten bunnies.
Yeah.
It's Lent. That's what it is.
It's kind of cleansing, I think.
Yeah.
And it seems kind of rhythmic for the year, because winter is a time of turning in, and if you're not careful and you run out of food, you're kind of in trouble. So it's a time of being really careful about managing your food and daylight hours, and it's darker longer than it's light. And I think Lent kind of is a reflection of some of that. And I really don't remember doing anything about Lent, except in my family growing up, I thought it was the Dutch influence of austerity. But there was none of this showy business. I've managed to throw that off, but it was the clothing that you wore, the car that you drove, or talking about money, or any of those things were, pardon the phrase, verboten the way I grew up. So the idea of putting ashes on my head is anathema, because that's being, as Calvin said, showy. And that, the way I grew up was, we didn't do any of that stuff. And so,
I thought we just did it because it was an expression of our faith, like wearing a cross, and an expression for Lent, and a reminder of ashes to ashes.
Yeah.
There was times when I was a teenager, I didn't like it. It's like, I'm getting a blackhead, because you have to put dirt on your face. But other than that, I don't know, and I didn't realize other churches didn't do this. I had no idea.
The first time I did it, I was so uncomfortable. I was so uncomfortable that I had this expressive thing on my forehead, and I was so uncomfortable, I finally washed it off.
I'm sorry, I'm getting the hook sign. But thank you for coming. I hope this has been a useful thought experiment for us all, and enjoy your pancakes.
Thank you so much, John. This was a wonderful presentation and conversation. I think we all really enjoyed it. Just so you know, next week we will not be meeting at this time. We have a program after worship. Is it 11:30?
I think it starts at noon.
Noon. At the Methodist Church. Janet Foster was supposed to do a presentation on the Green Book a few weeks ago. Got snowy, so now she's going to be doing that. So I invite you after worship next Sunday.
Next, Donuts and Theology in the morning.
Is it that week?
No.
Yes.
I think so.
Yeah, and then the following week, we have a very special guest of Tom Sheffield, and he will be with us for 2 weeks after that. So we're excited to have him here. So thank you all. Okay, Mike.
Thanks for thinking of me.
I love it.
John, that was great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.